Hello, how are you?
Man, I am doing great. My son just texted me that he got a summer job that starts, it's full time and it starts literally like 3 days after school lets out and is exactly the length of the summer.
Wow,
So
that's
isn't that
wonderful.
perfect? Yeah.
Yes.
He's going to be, there is a local private uh, conservationist, conservatory is a music thing, but conservation means like wilderness and woods and things. So it's a conservation land that is privately owned, and he is going to be groundskeeping for the summer.
Okay. That's good,
So
honest work.
that is, and he's super excited about it. He has done only things involving customers and the public since he could get a job, and he is excited to do something that allows him to just do his work, listen to his music, and at the end of the day, be able to see the difference he has made.
Oh, absolutely. And I imagine he'll get to operate heavy machinery, which is not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And he's got, oddly, from his theater experience, he's got some decent experience with that sort of stuff. So, but
Huh.
anyway, how are you doing?
Well, I am very tired for all the best reasons. I'm still a little jet lagged from my mission trip to Aizawl, India, which was wonderful. But then last night I stayed up late hanging out with my wife and we were watching a show, which is rare for me, but it was super fun and we really enjoyed laughing and connecting over the show. And then we finally got to bed late. And then right in the middle of the night, my daughter called from Africa, forgetting the time zone difference, and just had a lot of debriefing to do about some of her experiences. And so I got to talk to her for, I don't know, an hour, hour and a half. I was laying in bed. It was dark. It was all the middle of the night. I don't really know how long we were talking, but it was wonderful to hear from her and just process what God's doing in her life and how she's responding to that. And so I didn't get hardly any sleep last night, but I wouldn't change any of it.
Ooh, that's a whole lot better than being tired because work required you to stay at work for an extra 4 hours.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's part of my life too, but you know, yeah, this is better.
Yeah. And no shade to the work that you do or the fact that your work sometimes requires that. No criticism intended. I'm
Sure.
just saying I think this is
No.
better.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're 100% right. It is better. So, yeah. But I am excited. So, just in real life, not podcast time, but in real life time, we haven't recorded in multiple weeks because of my trip to India, your trip with your son to Greece. And goodness, like, I'm just excited to get into this today.
That's right. I was thinking we recorded last week, but we didn't. I had to cancel because honestly, I double booked myself. But yes, so this is our first conversation that we've had in quite a while. And so I am thrilled that I want to talk about sin today.
Yeah, that's a very welcome back topic. What would you like to say about sin?
Yay, sin! No, I was starting to say that before you said, what would you like to say about sin? So that was just my response to it being our welcome back topic. But when you think about sin, if someone were to ask you, and I'm curious for our listeners, I'm going to pause for a second. When you think about sin, what is sin? Josh, when you think about it, typically, what is your answer to that question?
This sounds very dictionary-like, but I guess my working definition would be acts of commission or omission against God.
Yeah, right? Like this is the basic definition I always used as a pastor was God has a plan for your life, and if you think of that like the bullseye, it is missing the mark, right? Like this is literally the definition of sin.
Yeah.
And I don't want to disagree with any of that. However, as I have been reading Paul lately and reading for my seminary classes as well, I have been really caught by the fact that there are two levels of sin that Paul talks about. He certainly talks about this sort of sin as act or disobedience or missing the mark, right? Like, no question, that's sin. But maybe more often, Paul talks about sin as an almost conscious entity. And I want to talk about that today. I think we don't give enough attention in our theological thinking to what it means for sin to be this other, deeper, darker, invasive. The word that keeps coming to mind is it's almost like a conscious cancer, right? Like it is active and reactive and responsive, and on some level it is alive. First of all, do you know what I'm talking about? Like, I'm not making this up, right? Like Paul talks about this.
Paul definitely talks about this, and it seems to be a large part of the book of Romans in particular, where he talks about sin almost in personified ways. Like, and, honestly, if we go all the way back to Genesis and the Cain and Abel story, God refers to sin this way when he's warning Cain. Sin is crouching at your door and it wants to have you. You must become master over it. Like, that is a very externalized, personified view of this capital S sin that is different than just what I choose to do or not do.
Yeah. It has this sense of being a beast, right? Like some sort of violent, unsafe predator. And that was one of the verses I'd come to as well, kind of stepping out of, okay, this is what I think Paul is saying, but what does the rest of the Bible say? Yeah, I thought that is that the first time sin is mentioned? Do we actually get the clear sin language in the Garden of Eden?
Ooh, that's worth finding out. I don't actually know.
We are both now using the deeply theological tool, Google.
You are. I've got my Bible open.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want you to know that 3 things that came up in Google all say, yes, that is the first time sin is mentioned. I'm curious if what was that thing you called it? Bible also says the same thing.
I cannot read my Bible faster than Google can spit out an answer, so I will just trust that Google is right.
Even for that to be the introductory statement about sin, it's, if we were to rewrite those verses in behavioral terms, right? I'm reading it, and 4:7 says, Genesis 4:7 says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. I think we would have said something like, if you do not do well, you will be sinning and corrupting your desires. We would have made the the subject of every part of the sentence, Cain himself, as if he were the only actor in the scene.
Yes. Yes, 100%. And yet the Bible refers to sin as its own actor in the drama, which is crazy. And Paul does this, right? When he talks about, sin seizing the opportunity afforded through the law to grab a hold of us or to corrupt us or what have you, he's again personifying sin. It's a character in the story that God introduced the law and sin took advantage of it.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what I actually think this piece of theology begins to make more sense if we think of sin as a living, again, a cancer, something that can be present in us and almost below the surface or dormant in some way, right? Like, because I think this is all in that language of crouching at your door. It's not in there yet, but it's there, right? That has the sort of, you're on an edge. And if sin were just a behavior issue, then what we would say is just don't sin. But what
Yeah.
God does instead is give the law, which doesn't stop sin, but instead draws it out into the open where it can be dealt with, right?
Tell me more about that, because again, I think that language flirts with the idea that God is causing us to sin. I don't think that's what you're saying.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I think if God sets a boundary and says, if you act this way, you are in the wrong, and if you act this way, you are in the right. Or to use maybe more biblical language, if you act this way, you are sinning, but if you act this way, you are righteous. If he draws that line, if the nature of sin as an enslaving power or a cancer or a parasite, let's call it that. Let's call it a parasite that is scurrying into the darkness, right? And going to drag you with it. By drawing the line and saying the light is on this side and the dark is on this side, when the cancer or parasite within you draws you to the dark side of that line, that's not God's fault because he put the line there. But it is drawing out the fact that there is something parasitic or cancerous or corrupting deeply entrenched within your being that draws you towards the dark rather than the light. And it is showing off the fact that you have that thing. You can't pretend there's no problem anymore.
Okay, so this is interesting because I feel like sometimes the Bible talks about sin in an external fashion, right? We go back to the Cain and Abel story. Sin is crouching at your door. I don't take that to mean that sin resides within Cain, but that it is ready to pounce on Cain from the outside. And so, and I get that kind of language from Paul as well. I feel like, again, it is something outside that would seize the opportunity afforded by the law to corrupt it and to corrupt us along with it. So I view it very much external. However, Paul talks about our sin nature or our flesh, and he seems to indicate that that is resident within us. And so I think the Bible, in my mind, speaks about it both ways. And it sounds like you're really focused on the internal dynamics of sin rather than the external personification of sin.
Well, I think this is a great point. I think there is an element of both, right? There is an external reality that we are commanded. And this is interesting to me. Going all the way from Genesis 4 all the way to Paul pairs several times the idea of sin and mastery, just like Genesis 4, right?
Mm.
Sin shall not be your master, it says in Romans. Where is that? Late in Romans 6, I think. But
Yeah, right. Because it is for freedom that we have been set free.
right, exactly. And so there's this idea, perhaps, that sin as an external reality gets its tendrils into every human being. And the act of salvation is to surgically remove the reality of sin that has sunk its claws into us. This is, what is that? 2 Corinthians. I can't believe I can't remember this, but it's the verse that says, he became sin that we might become righteousness, right? Like our sin is transferred, and we don't mean just our sinful behaviors. Perhaps it is this actual sort of cancerous predator and its power over us that is transferred over to Christ, that has to die when he dies. And yet we have verses in which Paul says we have to crucify ourselves, right, daily. And so I think there's a way in which perhaps sin is still internal on some level. Otherwise, it wouldn't be dying to myself. It would just be shutting a door.
I think this is so interesting. I think it's important to be careful about our language here. And I think Paul really threads the needle. But at the same time, he's explicit, especially I love that you brought up Romans 6, this idea that it is for freedom that we have been set free. Like, if we are dead to sin, how can we ever be enslaved to it again? I think he is emphatic about the formal and final break with sin that comes with salvation. And so the verse you were looking for, by the way, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So I feel like that exchange is so final that we should be cautious about talking about what effects of sin remain. Are they internal to us? Are they external to us? And I think that distinction matters when we talk about somebody who has been saved and set free.
I do as well, though I would suggest, I think you're saying they are now permanently and forever external for people who have become followers of Jesus. Is that right?
I think that's my starting point, and I'm interested to see what you have to say.
I am going to suggest that we can surrender to sin again. Right? This is the whole argument I think Paul is making, both in those middle chapters of Romans and later on in Galatians. Right? For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. I think in much of Romans 6 as well, the point he's making is you can be free and you have been formally set free, but sin, which again is more than just an action, it is this, maybe we should use the biblical category of a power. If I can I bunny trail for a moment here?
Yeah.
One of the things my son and I talk about all the time, and we did this, we were in Greece just a couple of weeks ago, like you said, and we were looking at these incredible temples to people like, or to the gods, to Athena and Poseidon. And we got into a lot of conversations about the spiritual or supernatural realm. And one of the things that we talk about all the time when we're talking about this, he and I, is this idea that we often, as evangelical Christians, populate the spiritual realm functionally with God and Satan, who we know aren't equals, but they are the two captains of two teams, one of whom is transcendent and one of whom is not. And then
Okay.
lots of angels, some of whom are following God and some of whom are following Satan, but who are all functionally the same type of being. And that's it. Our supernatural realm functionally has three types of being: angel, Satan, who is functionally an angel, and God.
Yeah.
And Paul's use of the word power sometimes makes me think that there are a range of spiritual realities far more nuanced than that. And sin feels like one of them to me. Like, is it possible that sin in reality is actually like, if those are sentient creatures, if angels are sentient creatures, is it conceivably possible that there is a non-sentient sort of version of a beast in the spiritual realm, and that is what sin is?
Yeah, 100%. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether or not it is sentient, because I think, some of your early comments seem to think that maybe it really did have some ability to react and think and plot and scheme.
Yeah, I have been wrestling with this. I think if we, I think we can officially call it alive. Again, if we use natural categories, I'm at least ruling out rocks and trees and requiring it to be either animal or human, right? And I wonder if it is somewhere in the middle. Like, even in the natural realm, there is a range here, right? My dog is far more self-aware than a butterfly, I think.
Hmm.
I am told by those who know and by articles I read that elephants and whales are even more self-aware.
Yeah.
That suggests to me a range. So, do I think sin is described as fully, I always forget sentient and sapient. I always forget which one means which. But self-aware and like fully human is kind of my simple definitions of those. But is there some level of self-awareness and ability to choose action in sin? Absolutely. That's as far as I get. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know that I've thought too much about it, but I do think that Scripture characterizes it as having some sort of malicious intent, which seems to and taking advantage of the opportunity afforded through the law, right? These are schemes, these are plots, these are choices in light of events. But then at the same time that that's true, the Bible also refers to the devil himself like a roaring lion ready to pounce. And so maybe they have linked the two, or maybe they operate independently. I don't know. So it's fascinating to me to think about this capital S sin as this external being. And, this is where I start to think that this affects our understanding of other areas of theology. Like, if we really took this seriously, what does this mean for our definition of salvation, or the official term of soteriology? What is salvation when we talk about, I'm not just being delivered from my sins of commission or omission, I'm being delivered from the tendrils of an infectious external beast that has hitherto sunk its claws into me in ways that I cannot escape from.
I think you're exactly right. I think the simplified evangelical approach to salvation, to soteriology, is basically, he paid my debt.
Yeah.
I did wrong. justice needed to be enacted. Somebody had to pay the consequences. Therefore, Jesus did it. And this suggests that that wouldn't be enough. You could pay my debt and I'd still have sin mastering me.
Right.
Something more was required. Which I think, and this is where I think we have to see salvation as both, and we're going to talk about this in an upcoming episode when we talk about conversion, but I think we have to see salvation as a moment in time, but also as a process. The fact that I have to crucify my flesh even after being saved still seems to suggest to me that the line between internal and external is not as cut and dry as you want it to be. That perhaps there are just ongoing effects within me that I have to conquer, and sin itself is external to me. That may be it. It may be that I need to fully appropriate the reality that sin has been conquered in me. And maybe that's where I land. Maybe that's a way that I'm comfortable saying it. I need to fully appropriate the reality that sin has been uprooted in my life.
Yeah. J.P. Moreland has such a great analogy here that I think is super helpful. And it's one that I think I mentioned on the podcast like a couple years ago. But he talks about it in terms of tennis. Like if you're going to learn tennis, you have to learn, quote unquote, tennis righteousness, how to do a forehand properly, how to do a backhand properly, how to serve properly, how to run up on the net well, and all of these things that you need to learn tennis righteousness. But you also need to unlearn tennis unrighteousness. Your muscles are trained to operate a certain way. Your muscles respond a certain way. Your wrist may tend to bend a certain way, or your elbow may tend to react a certain way. And you have to unlearn all of those things. And so that to me is the crucify your flesh kind of thing. It's not that sin still reigns in my mortal body, like Paul says it does not. It's that my mortal body has been attuned to the rhythms and the nature of sin. And I need to unlearn the way my body has been tuned. I need to crucify my flesh.
It is such a great way to describe it. You know what? So I have had this experience with my physical body. About, 8 or 10 years ago, whenever it was, I got really bad tendonitis in my knee from running. And of course, I default to trying harder. Like when in doubt, just try harder. So when running started to hurt, I didn't think to myself, let me go to the doctor and see what's wrong. I thought, I'm being a wimp. Let me run harder. So for about 6 months, I ran full steam on a knee that had tendonitis. And my physical therapist, when the doctor sent me to the physical therapist, first of all, the physical therapist told me that was a bad plan. That running harder just made it worse. And so she gave me all these exercises to get it kind of to heal the tendonitis. But then, and this is the most interesting thing, the most important thing I learned in physical therapy was not those exercises, though I still use some of those exercises today. What it was the fact that what gave me tendonitis was that my stride was too long. I don't understand why, but I know that from that day on, I have had to shorten my running stride. And to this day, 10 years later, and I have run consistently for 10 years since then, like I took 7 months off or whatever, and then I went right back to running and I still run. If I am not paying attention, I can feel the fact that my stride elongates and it pulls too hard on my knees, and I have to fix my stride again. And so 10 years later, I'm still relearning what I guess in your analogy would be running righteousness.
Yeah, exactly.
And if I didn't, I would have had ongoing tendinitis over and over and over again. And I think that's what you're saying is there is getting rid of the tendinitis, or really we're talking about something that would be more parasitic than that. But that leaves me in a state of having to relearn a bunch of things. And if I don't learn those things, I'm going to end up with tendinitis all over again.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we still have this flesh. We still have this way of operating, what we consider a normal stride, that needs to be unlearned and actively resisted in order to preserve ourselves and to not cause further harm. Which
and this is go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I had forgotten about Moreland's metaphor here, and I think it is so helpful in this situation. I'm really glad you brought it up, because the fact of the matter is we sometimes get confused because sometimes Paul makes the flesh sound good or neutral. Sometimes it sounds bad. But in reality, if we think of the flesh as the sort of things that we have learned so well that they are just ingrained in our bodies, right? Like I'm teaching my daughter to drive right now. There are things I don't have to think about driving anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's my flesh. And not in a bad way. Like I need a flesh. I can't process everything in the world without some things sort of becoming memorized patterns of behavior.
Yes. To extend that analogy a little bit, that was one of my barometers for when I was teaching my kids to drive. One of my barometers for how much brain power have they freed up? How much have they automated some of the processes of driving? Was whether or not they remembered to turn off their wipers. And, sometimes the wipers are making some awful, horrendous sound indicating the rain has stopped. You can turn me off. And they don't hear it. They don't notice. Yeah, because their brain is so full on all the little tiny steps that they have to take to drive. And their brain hasn't automated those steps yet. And so once they start tuning into the wipers, then I start going, okay, all right, you've gotten some of this mastered then.
Oh, that's exactly it. My daughter just recently, so to back out of my driveway, we have a 2-car garage, and you have to sort of turn the car slightly to the middle of the driveway and then straighten out again, and then back up the length of the driveway, and then turn the wheel hard at exactly the right moment. And otherwise you are like all sorts of fouled up. And my daughter is 75% there. But you're absolutely right. When she doesn't have to think about backing out of the driveway, I will know that she has gotten to a certain point in driving, just because it's in her flesh.
Yeah.
Which is such a cool way to think about it. If you just think of it, it is learning that has been dispersed amongst, it's the same way. I'm sure you've had this happen far more back in the day, but do you remember when you didn't know somebody's phone number, but you could dial it?
Okay, so that's so fascinating, because I had that same experience when I left 911 and then came back. So I hadn't worked for 911 for 11 months, and I came back and I was nervous because so much of what we have to do there is speed, and it's automatic, and you just have to react and have it be done because we operate so efficiently. And I remember there was a moment where an activity came my way and my body just did it. My fingers typed what it needed to type, and I just did it. And then my brain kicked on and I realized what I had just done and went, it's still there. That's great. It was such an encouraging moment for me.
Yes, exactly. So, boy, we are coming up on time, and I love what we've dug into, but I feel like we've left off a really practical question of what does this mean for how we grow in Christ and help others to grow in Christ?
Well, I think the distinction that we've made here is a really important one. Because on the one hand, I'm arguing, and I think you're following me here, that for somebody who has been saved, sin is entirely external to that individual. It does not dwell within us and does not have mastery over us like it once did. It is entirely external. Now, we can, just like a deposed king, we could still go and say, well, I know you're not really king anymore, but I still follow you. So tell me what to do, sir. Like, we can still submit ourselves to a deposed king. And so I think Paul warns us about that. But then, so I think that's an important distinction, that's where sin is. And that's our danger, is to go back to sin and treat it like a master, even though we don't have to. And then on the other hand is this idea of the flesh and the way that even after we have been saved, we have some habits that live within our flesh that we need to unlearn. And we need to literally put on Christ, put on his body, his life, and learn his unforced rhythm of grace, like Eugene Peterson so eloquently stated. Learn righteousness. And so I think that, to me, affects how we grow and how we encourage others to grow, if we can keep those two things very clear in our minds.
I think you're absolutely right. And I would add to that this means, number one, much of the time, the correct answer to sin is not to tell people to stop it, right?
Like
Second,
the great Bob Newhart.
Right, exactly.
Sketch.
But the other thing, and I think this is coming straight out of Dallas Willard's Renovation of the Heart, is that what we need to be developing for ourselves and with others is a routine of habits that rewire our heart, our mind, and our will. Because that's what's happened, is we have habits that have wired our, kind of worked into our flesh, a certain way of being. If I wanted to learn to drive in England, I would need to develop some different habits because I'd be on the opposite side of the road.
Yeah.
And I would have to look different ways. I would have to pay attention to different things. I would have to memorize certain different facts. I would have to redefine certain stimuli. I would have to all sorts of things. But I think, and this is where I appreciate Willard's kind of summary, that really what it comes down to is a systemic decision to adopt practices that rewire our mind, our heart, and our will. And
yes,
looking at it that comprehensively, I think, is incredibly powerful.
I totally agree. I want to add one final piece to that, and that is the grace that covers all of that. It is by God's grace that we have been set free from sin, the big external S, sin. And it is by grace that we unlearn the habits of sin and we learn the habits of righteousness. All of that is an act of grace, and it is a daily, ongoing dependency on that grace and cooperation with the Holy Spirit that makes that possible. And yes, those practices are integral, but they are always done with the cooperation of the Holy Spirit and dependence upon a daily grace.
At least for me, I will say I need a daily reset. Come back to the fact that grace is the foundation of all of this. I am an achiever by nature, as many of us are, and it looks different. And I think one of the dangerous things is to think, well, I know that person tries to earn salvation and I don't do that. So therefore I'm not trying to earn my salvation. But I think deep down, there are a lot of us who claim to be grace people who are trying to impress God, who are trying to earn our seat at the table, who are trying desperately to be worthy. And I think that the challenge is for us, for me at least, is to be honest about the ways in which that's where I'm at and to be open to resetting that every day with coming back to this foundation of grace that you're talking about. That is so, you're absolutely right.
Man, so good. Before we started recording today, we talked a lot about our desires for this podcast and our desires for connecting with our audience. And I want to turn to the audience and just say our heart and our passion is that these kinds of conversations be normalized, that you have an opportunity to engage in conversations around sin and grace and what it means to be set free from sin, but still unlearning old patterns and old habits in our flesh. Like, what a great thing to ponder and to ponder together with a friend. So we want to encourage you, if this podcast could be a springboard to having a conversation with a friend, by all means do that. But at the end of the day, just have one more conversation. One more conversation with somebody that is just iron sharpening iron and an opportunity to engage deeper in your faith. We would love nothing more.
Yes, that's exactly it. What you need to do to make that one more conversation happen. I know for me, I have to literally schedule it. I'm having lunch with somebody tomorrow that it took us 15 texts back and forth to schedule that lunch. And it's something we've been working on for a week and a half. I have another friend. I know I got to schedule it every month. We're going to, whatever. But what can you do to make one more meaningful conversation happen in your life?
Yeah. Man, oh man. Well, in any good conversation, there is plenty of time for meaningful. And we also, I think you and I need to work on this, but making time for the silly. And so yes. I guess that's time for the Which Josh question.
All right. Well, I am excited about this one. Today's Which Josh question is, which Josh got lost on his first date?
Okay, so this is me. I'm actually kind of surprised why I haven't talked about this on the podcast, but our first date was right there where you live. It was in Springfield, Missouri. And our college was about a half an hour north of Springfield. And so I didn't know Springfield very well. This was about a month and a half into us being at college, and Shelly and I were going to go on a date. And so I made sure to check with a local and get directions to a coffee shop. And so we were going to go to an on-campus concert. We made it to that just fine. And then we were going to go down to Springfield and have coffee. And we get about halfway there, and Shelly goes, "Oh, I was just in Springfield the other week with some friends, and I think you're supposed to turn there." And I said, I know, but I got I got directions from a local that said we need to go this way. She's like, I don't know. I kind of think you're supposed to turn. And I listened to her and we turned. And that was the last time I knew where I was. And this is long before, like you could just pull it up on your smartphone and determine where you could go. Like I didn't even have a MapQuest printout. I just had handwritten directions from somebody who lived in Springfield. And I knew nothing of where we were or where we were going. So we drove around for a very, very long time. I don't know how many times we backtracked and saw the same streets or didn't. It was a long time. We should have gone out. We should have been to coffee by 9:30, 10 o'clock. And it was probably 1:30 before we stopped and we were like,
Ooh.
well, let's at least have like a burger and a shake over here. And oh man, it was terrible. But we found our way back home to the dorms probably around 3:30 in the morning. But yeah, that was our first date.
Oh man. I remember those days with no fondness whatsoever. When there was no Google Maps, no CarPlay. I don't miss that. No nostalgia here for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause it was like, once you were lost and you just had to figure it out.
We had this happen on our way to church when we first moved back to Boston years and years ago. We had looked up directions to a church I wanted to visit. We ended up so late because we got lost on the way there that we were 15 minutes late to the next service.
That is awesome.
It was awful. And of course we came in fully ready to engage God in worship with no distractions whatsoever.
No, none. And I'm sure your marriage was in great shape. All was well with the world.
Exactly. Oh man. Well, hey, you ready to have another conversation next week?
I cannot wait. Yes, let's do it.
All right, I'll talk to you then.
What?
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
What's the car plan?